Cool. All right. Well, thank you for starting that. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nadia, and just a heads up, the webinar is being recorded. The reason for this is just, for folks who aren't able to make it, it's a way for them to learn and access it later and stay connected in that way. And you're here at the War on Youth meeting, one of our weekly meetings we do with the coalition. This one is focusing on the various programs targeting young people, youth, and how we're fighting against that. And just before we get started, I wanted to just share, I wanted to double check if the chat is open. It looks, yes, it is open. People have been chatting. So if you have any, questions or comments throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them there. We like to have our meetings as interactive as possible. So feel free to put any, like I said, any questions, any comments on there. And in terms of if you would like to say anything, you can go ahead and put your hand up, and then we'll be able to unmute you that way. That's just to prevent any Zoom bombing that may happen. So as I said, welcome again. My name is Nadia. And today I'm really excited for this webinar. We're going to have the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. We're going to be looking at the work they're doing, how we can support their month of action they're having. And before I pass it over to Matios and to them, just a really quick background about what is our War on Youth fight. And it's really looking at the programs and policies that have been emerging that target Black and Brown and Muslim and Indigenous youth and immigrant youth under the guise of fighting terrorism, fighting violent extremism. And essentially, we know that youth criminalization is nothing new. We've seen for decades now the gang narrative being used to target Black and Brown youth. And, now we've been seeing for years now the coming together of that narrative along with the violent extremism and terrorism narrative. And so within that, there's various programs we're fighting. The LA focused one is called PATHE, which stands for providing alternatives to hinder extremism. And this falls under a much larger umbrella of one program known as CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, which is through the Department of Homeland Security. And essentially that, in the typical trajectory of government criminalization, it names behaviors as suspicious and as a way to justify criminalization. And within CVE, the one we also focus on is preventing violent extremism, PVE, which specifically targets K through 12 youth. It says behaviors are suspicious, such as being too much into your culture, expressing anger, frustration in schoolwork, being in poverty, being a migrant. So really, essential, basically things that describe who our youth are, right? And like I said, within this, the more specific program to LA is called PATHE. And this involves LAPD specifically. And essentially, a grant was just approved for it as well, which basically has constructs a team of snitches, of informants, to help facilitate this, the community snitching on each other. And that's one of the things that makes these programs especially dangerous, is they're claiming to not take a quote policing approach using the police. But that's BS. The police are involved. This is through the DHS and LAPD. And two, it still gets community members to police each other and then end up reporting it. So I'll just pause there. That's a very sort of broad overview, right, of the programs we are fighting. And then and before I pass it over to Matios, we meet every month, every third Wednesday of the month, where we do our working meetings, where we are creating pop ed material, popular education material, artwork, strategizing, researching, seeing how we can, support folks in different actions as well. So also want to invite you to that, which will be next Wednesday as well. So I'll just pause there, and I want to see, does anybody just have any questions or any comments on that? I'll check the chat too. Okay. Okay, great. I'll pass it over then to you, Matthias. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Nadia. Hey, folks, my name is Matthias. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an organizer with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And yeah, I'm really just here today to welcome Mamta, who's with the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. And I know we've also got some other homies from Black Alliance for Peace, like Atlanta, Tunde on the call to talk about October and their fight against AFRICOM and this broader campaign. And I'm gonna link their website with, I think, some actions into the chat. But yeah, we're really thrilled to have y'all here. Obviously, the Stop LAPD Spying and specifically the War on Youth is concerned with anti-imperialist efforts worldwide, especially tackling U.S. imperialism in Africa. So that's really all I've got to say. I'm just going to give it to you, Mamta, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Matthias. Hi, everyone. My name is Mamta. I am usually with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, but today I'm also joining you as a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to the War on Youth team for sharing space with us, and to Matthias for all your organizing efforts to make this happen. Again, really excited to be here. So I'm going to be facilitating the first part of our community meeting today, and I will be talking about the organization's campaign to get the US out of Africa during this International Month of Action Against AFRICOM, the purpose of which is to raise public awareness of the US empire's ongoing military occupation of the African continent, this occupation which is spreading violence and instability in the region, undermining the sovereignty of African peoples, looting African resources, and essentially using the continent as a testing ground for new forms of surveillance and warfare. I'm also, before I go any further, really excited that we do have on the call, as Matthias mentioned, our comrade Tunde Osazua who's from the Black Alliance for Peace, and he's actually the coordinator of the US Out of Africa Network, which is the organizing arm of this campaign, of the Down AFRICOM campaign. So very excited. Welcome to all of you. And I hope today you will just chime in and share from your wealth of knowledge at any time during this presentation. All right, so I am going to switch to sharing my screen here. Okay, let's see if I can do two things at the same time. Okay, did that work? All right, can everyone see that? It looks okay. You can see on the screen, okay. Let me see here. All right, and there are no overlapping windows, right? It's ridiculous, I still don't know how to do this. You can just see my presentation and not anything else. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I will begin by spending a few minutes introducing the work of the Black Alliance for Peace, or BAP for short. Then I will give some background on AFRICOM and hopefully provide some, critical context for why we are organizing against it. And, finally, I'll share some resources on where you can learn more about this campaign and other ways in which you can join this fight. I hope to leave some time at the end for us to have some discussion on these topics and for folks to ask any questions. And in the meanwhile, please feel free to drop your name, where you're joining us from, and also please share any reflections or thoughts or questions you have also in the chat as we go along here. Okay, so the Black Alliance for Peace was founded on April 4th, 2017, on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's historic Riverside Church speech in 1967, in which he spoke out against US militarism and imperialism and denounced the US war on Vietnam. So BAP's mission is to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement through political education, organizing and movement support, and other activities like this campaign. BAP works to oppose both militarized domestic state repression as well as the permanent war agenda of the US state globally. BAP also has a solidarity network as a way for non-Africans to contribute to BAP's work, and I am part of that network. And for the Black Alliance for Peace, the war being waged against the working class communities within the United States mirrors the war that's waged on African people and other nationally oppressed peoples across the world who are victims of US imperialism. And so by linking these issues of state violence and militarism, BAP concentrates its efforts on opposing the US war agenda globally, as well as the war and repression that's being waged on Black and Brown communities domestically. So accordingly, no compromise, no retreat, defeat the war against African Black people in the US and abroad is the key programmatic work of the Alliance. This campaign provides a common collective direction for the work of BAP, which is centered around values of peace, of people-centered human rights, and anti-imperialist education and organizing. The work of the campaign is also seen as a key element of BAP's effort to build Black left unity in broader, radical, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and peace movements. And specifically, as part of this campaign, the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, which is BAP's central campaign, this campaign seeks to abolish the Department of Defense 1033 program, which, as many of you know, it sees the transfer of surplus military equipment to local police departments domestically, to stop Israeli training of US police forces, to shut down the US Africa Command, which is what we will talk about today, to close the 800 plus US foreign military bases across the world, to eliminate Operation Relentless Pursuit and all federal anti-crime programs that target Black and other colonized peoples. The Operation Relentless Pursuit was started under the Trump administration and targets specific cities, predominantly Black and Brown cities across the country, with a surge of federal policing and local policing. It's just basically hyper policing of our communities. Another aspect of the campaign is to end illegal US sanctions and stop the US subversion and foreign political interventions by the US, expose and abolish NATO as a white supremacist criminal structure. And there are a few others that you can learn about at BAP's website, which is at blackallianceforpeace.com. And I won't go over them here now. But one subsection of the campaign is the U.S. Out of Africa network. And our demands for the U.S. Out of Africa campaign is the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Africa, the demilitarization of the African continent, the closure of U.S. bases throughout the world, and a demand that the Congressional Black Caucus oppose AFRICOM and conduct hearings on AFRICOM's impact on the African continent through the participation of U.S. and African civil society. So as part of this work, BAP organizes an International Month of Action against AFRICOM in October in an effort to raise the public's awareness about the U.S. hybrid war and imperialist policies perpetrated by AFRICOM. Before we get into AFRICOM, I want to play a short video about BAP. And Matthias, I'm wondering if you'd be so kind to set that up for us. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing.
The U.S. is birthed from savagery. Europeans committed genocide against native peoples and stole their land, all while kidnapping and enslaving native and African people to turn a profit. Now, over 400 years later, the United States is a massive empire. It has 800 military bases and at least a dozen colonies scattered across the globe. Ever since its founding, the U.S. has always been at war, and it's the only country in history to use nuclear weapons against people. At this very moment, the U.S. is engaged in at least 7 wars of occupation and regime change. The mission? To ensure U.S. businesses have access to land, resources, and cheap or slave labor. But the 1% also wages war against Black and colonized people in the U.S., just as they've done from the start. Police continue to murder, brutalize, and surveil Black people. Our communities are impoverished, starved of resources, and thrown in jail. All the while, police departments become more and more like occupying armies. And the military budget, well, it just keeps getting bigger. The Black Alliance for Peace was launched in 2017.
The Black Alliance for Peace, as an organization, committed to revitalizing the traditional anti-war positions of the Black community.
The United States is the worst abuser of human rights in the world. If you look at the invasions, the proxy wars, the sanctions.
The powers that be are seeing a threat to the status quo.
It does not matter whether the United States government agrees with Maduro and his policies, because 6 million Venezuelans wanted him to lead them. As a sovereign people, they have a right to determine their own direction and future.
Everyone has a place in this movement. We must be organized. If we want peace, we have to be willing to fight for it.
Our campaign is no compromise, no retreat. Defeat the war on African Black people in the U.S. and abroad. The campaign includes the demands to end police militarization, stop their training by the Israeli Defense Force, shut down AFRICOM, remove all U.S. military presence from Africa, defund the military, and close the 800 military bases around the world. Black people have always been the consciousness and change agents within this brutal regime. Now can be no different. We are in the heart of the empire, and we must remember our fight for liberation is connected to the liberation of Black, brown, and working class people everywhere. It is time for us to stand up to oppose U.S. war and murder and defeat the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination. That is why the Black Alliance for Peace was founded. And that is why we need you.
Thank you so much, Matheus. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Unmute. Okay, so I'm going to talk about AFRICOM now. So this is actually a screenshot from the Department of Defense website. The US has the largest military force on the planet. It spends more on its military budget than the next 11 countries combined. And so in its quest for global dominance, the US has carved the world up into these several military command centers. AFRICOM is one of 11 US combatant commands around the world. And this slide shows you sort of which ones are the other ones. They include the Southern Command, through which the US asserts its military presence in Latin America and the Caribbean nations. There's also the Indo-Pacific Command, which is used to project US military aggression against China. Others include the Central Command, which includes responsibility over the Middle East. AFRICOM is responsible for, quote, all US Department of Defense operations, exercises, and security operations on the African continent. On the African continent, on its island nations, and in surrounding waters. AFRICOM began in 2007 under George Bush, and it became fully operational on October 1st, 2008 under Barack Obama. This is why we mark October as the month of action against AFRICOM, because this is its 14th anniversary. AFRICOM is a US neocolonial military project. It was imposed unilaterally on Africans without their input or consent. According to its mission statement, AFRICOM counters transnational threats and malign actors, strengthens security forces, and responds to crises in order to advance US national interests and promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. Of course, it does none of these things. It currently has there are currently approximately 29 or so military bases in Africa through AFRICOM. Much of its operations and locations are shrouded in secrecy, so it's hard to get clear and precise information from the US government itself. And of course, the US has always maintained a neocolonial presence in Africa. Prior to the launch of AFRICOM, the US operated its military capacity through NATO, as well as through EUCOM, which is the U.S. European Command, which saw U.S. military operations in Africa from 1952 to 2007. AFRICOM, however, represents a continuation of and a reinvigoration of the legacy of colonialism in Africa. It's important to note that the U.S. military presence on the African continent expanded nearly 2,000% under Barack Obama's presidency, which, along with AFRICOM's Black U.S. leader, helped provide cover for the U.S. occupation of Africa under the guise of humanitarianism and the global war on terror. The real purpose of AFRICOM, of course, is to use U.S. military power to impose U.S. control on African land, resources, and labor for the benefit of U.S. multinational corporations, to line the pockets of defense contractors, and to preserve global hegemony under threat by an increasingly multipolar world with the economic rise of China and Russia. In the name of fighting extremism and promoting security, the U.S. military presence on the African continent has instead actually greatly destabilized the area. It's exacerbated the regional conflict, spread terror and violence, and we see this through one of its primary activities, which is to provide military-to-military training, and also to train local police forces in some instances. So this slide is actually from the Department of Defense AFRICOM website. And it shows what this program is. It says the overall objective of the International Military and Education Training Program is to further the goal of regional stability through effective, mutually beneficial military-to-military relations, to provide training, to augment the capabilities of participant nations' military forces, and to increase the ability of foreign military and civilian personnel to instill and maintain democratic values. So it's, as you can see, it's replete with this usual language about spreading Western values of freedom and democracy, and and it appears in its usual sort of racist connotations of the poor, uncivilized people in Africa being trained in democracy by receiving military training from the US. Here it says it exposes foreign students to US professional military organizations and procedures and the manner in which military organizations function under civilian control. It claims to introduce students to elements of US democracy, such as the US judicial system, legislative oversight, free speech, equality issues, and US commitment to human rights, which of course is a total farce. And it says it trains graduates to fill key leadership positions in the military of many African nations. And we see this, and this is part of why the kind of destabilization has occurred in the region ever since AFRICOM went there, because they're being trained by basically these US mercenaries. And it says the program specifically targets current and future military and civilian leadership in African nations, which is, a very scary prospect. So what has actually happened, partly as a result of this, and contrary to claims that the US is there to bring stability, as this article notes, violence in Africa has spiked since the founding of AFRICOM. And of course, this is not a coincidence. Since it was created, key indicators of security and stability in Africa have actually plummeted. And Africa has seen a huge surge in military operations by the US. And as this AFRICOM Watch Bulletin, thanks Tunde from BAP, in February of this year also notes, troops trained by AFRICOM have actually been behind 9 coups and probably more by now on the African continent in the 13 years of AFRICOM's existence. So it's highly destabilized the continent. Of course, in addition to this, one of the real reasons that the US is in Africa is for its natural resources. this kind of massive military presence through AFRICOM also prevents any serious competition to US control of these resources. Here's a quote from the head of AFRICOM at the time in 2008. And, he said, protecting the free flow of natural resources from Africa to the global market is one of AFRICOM's guiding principles. So, they're not even kind of hiding their motivations for being in Africa. And as this report here from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research points out, Africa is home to a range of natural resources. So 98% of the world's chromium, 90% of its cobalt and platinum, 70% of coltan, 70% of tantalite, 64% of its manganese, 50% of its gold, and this is a big one, 33% of uranium, as well as, of course, many other minerals are contained on the African continent. The UN Environmental Program estimates that Africa's natural capital accounts for between 30 to 50% of the total wealth of African countries. So African states largely rely on external revenues from the export of these natural resources, on aid programs from Western governments, and on institutional aid. And this reliance is a legacy of colonial rule on the continent, where extraction of natural resources for the benefit of the colonizing countries at home was the primary form of economic activity. So in the post-colonial period, efforts to socialize these resources and industrialize the countries that were carved up by the colonial rulers, these efforts to socialize resources were largely quashed by the West, right, through coups and assassinations and the installation of local corrupt elites who benefited personally from continuing this model of dependency on foreign aid and extraction of its rich resources for Western countries. And this is, of course, part of the story. Since AFRICOM was created, as the then head of AFRICOM stated, in part to protect the free flow of natural resources from Africa to the global market, the US also ensures this through other tools of colonial dominance, such as the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And as this, same report from Tricontinental notes, most African countries have interest bills from IMF loans that are much higher than their national revenues. So subjecting their national budgets to IMF imposed austerity measures that require these countries to cut spending in education and healthcare and other public goods. So these IMF loan conditions and structural, what are called the structural adjustment programs, also force denationalization of public goods and privatization of natural resources. So debt slavery through IMF loans is another tool of colonialism that undermines self-determination over resources and land, and actually creates the conditions that allow for the kind of US military occupation that we see in AFRICOM. Through IMF, countries in Africa are economically subjugated and forced to maintain these neoliberal economic policies. And so making sure that the people's resources are not used for the benefit of the people, but that they're secured for private plunder by Western capital. And, these resources are, of course, because they're used for Western capital, are carefully guarded by the US military. So the kind of surge of overt US military involvement in Africa that, over the last 2 decades is also explained by the new Cold War that the US is fighting against China and Russia, right? Which we know is creating a very, very dangerous situation right now for the future of this planet. And in this, it is also reminiscent of the first Cold War, during which the US provided military training and financial support to repressive governments, helped stage coups and assassinations in order to remove socialist and Pan-African leaders from power who were not willing to bend down to the US, who were not willing to allow their natural resources to be plundered by the West. And, as part of its new Cold War strategy, the US openly states that one of the functions of its military presence in Africa is to curb the rise of China and to undermine the ongoing economic relationships between African countries and China and Russia. US seeks to maintain this global hegemony through its heavy military presence in Africa. And, as this article notes in his testimony last year before the Senate Armed Services Committee, General Townsend, the then commander of AFRICOM, he identified Africa as a battleground for war with China, identified China and Russia as global threats alongside so-called, violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, which is also sort of a dubious categorization for anyone the US is waging a war against. It should be also mentioned that other colonial nations, particularly France, also has a large military presence in Africa. The US-French-led destruction of Libya by NATO in 2011 is in large part responsible for the current instability in the Sahel region of Africa. And again, the US uses, that instability to justify its military presence there. The illegal and the brutal decimation of Libya was also aided in large part by AFRICOM, which is, sort of little known. And of course, the purpose of that destruction of Libya was to snuff out its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, who, among other things, was opposed to US imperialism. He was opposed to AFRICOM setting up shop, setting up a base in his country. So, and he was brutally murdered by the West as a result. And what has ensued since Libya's destruction has been utter chaos and death in that region. And we don't have time here to go into detail about NATO and its sort of humanity-ending provocations, which it's also currently engaged in. But NATO is essentially synonymous with the US. And, its invasion of Libya was in clear violation of international law. Another, great affront to African sovereignty. And, part of what we've seen here, this is a map that shows on the left, the Sahel region of Africa, right below the Sahara Desert. And then on the right, it shows the infiltration of US forces, of US bases in that region. Of course, there are many, many more. This map just kind of shows US bases in that Sahel region. And, part of the story here is, of course, this was precipitated by the destruction of Libya. And, this kind of brings us to what I want to touch on briefly here, which is the deep sort of US and French militarization of the Sahel region. After the destruction of Libya, the Sahel region saw like a number of conflicts and criminal militancy, right? And using this as an excuse, the US and France moved in to set up a large military presence of their own. And this military presence is also driven by the fact that this region is home to extensive natural resources, not least of which is yellow cake uranium in Niger. And, which is why Niger is also home to several Western mining firms. It's said that 2 mines in Arlit, Niger, for example, they produce enough uranium to power 1 in 3 light bulbs in France. So, the French and the US have a very sort of strong colonial interest in being in this region. But in addition to securing and procuring these natural resources here, the large US and European military footprint in the Sahel is also there additionally for a second reason, which is to prevent the flow of migrants and refugees leaving West Africa and West Asia, right? So the conditions that are created by what we talked about, the IMF austerity measures and the ongoing Western subjugation and military interventions in African countries and other parts of the world also means that there's a large flow of migration through the Sahel region to Libya, up across the Mediterranean Sea into Europe. And so what is happening here is that essentially the US and European countries are building a large militarized border, which is pushing the European border from north of the Mediterranean Sea to south of the Sahara, and essentially colonizing this entire band of the African continent, where desperate migrants are fleeing hunger and war and are caught up in, and then they're caught by this large military apparatus that's been set up, and they are kept in these Western financed concentration camps, essentially. So again, this is all, largely the rhetoric here is that the US is fighting violent extremism and, securing its national interest here in this region. But part of what it's actually trying to do is keep out migrants from reaching the European border. And, part of pushing the boundary of Europe deep into Africa, part of that, is manifested in what in 2019 AFRICOM announced was the opening of the world's largest drone base in Agadez, Niger. And that drone base, I think it was started sometime in the mid-2010s. So they started building it. Its construction cost was over $100 million. And in fact, it's estimated that will cost about $30 million to operate annually, and that's not counting personnel and fuels for the aircraft. But anyway, in 2019, it became fully operational. And from here, the US conducts drone strikes and aerial surveillance across the Sahel and the Sahara Desert, and anybody who's sort of caught in its crosshairs. Like I mentioned, a lot of the activities of AFRICOM are actually shrouded in secrecy, but several reports note that the sprawling military activity and the ongoing expansion of new forms of warfare on the African continent, they actually indicate that the US is using West Africa, particularly with this large, massive, world's largest drone base, as the latest testing ground for US military artificial intelligence experiments. And it has essentially turned Africa into a lab for modern warfare. And as noted here, these military initiatives contribute to the African continent's status as a longstanding field site for experimentation that traverses the colonial and post-colonial eras. This slide is from the same article. Is there anyone who would be willing to read this paragraph on the right? And I'm sorry, I can't see all the screens, but
I'm happy to read it.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure. In its preparation for great power competition, the U.S. military is modernizing its Joint Airborne Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance (ISR) capabilities by exploring the uses of artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques for target identification. The final goal is to connect ISR sensors across all warfighting domains, such as space, air, land, sea, and cyber, directly with commanders and weapon systems, sharing data at an accelerated speed. In Niger, this project has materialized at the deployment of the new Block 5 variant of the MQ-9 Reaper, a drone first used in Syria in 2017. The Block 5's major upgrades include the ability to integrate and combine multiple data feeds, as well as to process this data more quickly. Since 2018, the U.S. has similarly armed their drones in Niger. In this fashion, West Africa joins Syria as a place that has become a test bed for this new wave of ISR technologies.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so as this article notes, in the name of preparing for great power competition against China and Russia, the U.S. military is modernizing its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities by exploring AI and machine learning techniques, using Africa essentially as its playground. And examples of this ISR systems that include optical, radar, infrared images, electronic signals collected through satellites, unmanned aircraft and aircraft systems, specialized ground sea or space-based equipment, and human intelligence systems. So, and here's another article from a few years ago, actually, that notes that through AFRICOM, the US military has turned Africa into a laboratory of modern warfare. And of course, there's a long legacy of colonial and neo-colonial experimentation of harmful technologies and warfare on colonized communities, something that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition also has noted extensively in its automating banishment report about the way that the LAPD operates, right? Similarly, the US military is essentially, it uses crises it creates in Africa as an opportunity to then try out and experiment new weapons and technologies in its secret wars on not just so-called violent extremists, but migrants and other indigenous people to the land under US occupation. So in fact, this is in large part explains the escalation in violence and bloodshed on the continent since the establishment of AFRICOM in 2007. Okay, so I think I'm gonna stop there for now. Actually share some resources about how you can join the fight. And you can join the US Out of Africa Network. I'll post these in the chat, these links in the chat. You can join the Black Alliance for Peace or the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network, and you can endorse the 2022 International Month of Action Against AFRICOM. And in general, I think because we are in the belly of the beast, we are, in the heart of US empire, it really behooves us to have public conversations about US, military presence in other parts of the world, and to stay informed about this increasing militancy across the planet. So I'm gonna, I think, stop there. And I think if folks have any questions, they can either raise their hand, put them in the chat, and we also have. We're lucky to have the benefit of having, our the national coordinator for this campaign on the call today. And so I'm gonna see if folks have any questions or thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mom. That was a really great presentation, very in-depth and covered all the right points. I really appreciated that. And yeah, I think the points around, Africa as a testing ground for a lot of, militarization, like the war, the struggle that's being waged on folks here domestically is key. And I appreciated, that you got into that. I think for us in BAP as well, as you know, like we see, Black and brown people here as colonized folks, and we also call for the removal or an end to police occupation of colonized Black communities here, right? Because we understand that those police forces aren't committed to protect and serve the interests of our communities, but they're serving the interests of powerful oppressive forces outside of them, just like in Africa, right? Like these AFRICOM's only really able to operate because of leadership on the continent that is aligned with the motives of the US and France and the other Western forces. So I think for us it's important to discuss like how the brutality, violence, and degradation of Black life in the colonized zones of the US by domestic police is replicated, or it is also taking place in maybe a different fashion in Africa by the global police represented by the Pentagon. And so I think for us, AFRICOM is just another site of struggle in the same war. Like you said, I think you really spoke to that at the beginning, but yeah, I really appreciated that, your remarks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we had a raised hand as well from Jill and Hamid. So we'll start with Jill.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
No, we can't hear you too well.
Can you hear me now?
No, yes.
Okay. So my question is, I spent a lot of time over these past 4 years or 5 years actually teaching both in Ethiopia and most recently in South Africa. And what I'd like to know is I'm familiar with sort of the elites. I think it was Tunde who just mentioned or talked about the role of the African elites in alignment with US policy interests. But I'm really interested in wanting to learn more a little bit about the on-the-ground movements against the militarization, right, or AFRICOM in Africa. So I've been looking around trying to find articles specifically, I don't know, primarily like from Pambazuka news sources to try to find more about what are local movements doing to push back on this in coordination with BAP.
Yeah, that's a great question. Tunde, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can start off. So through the US Out of Africa network, we saw the need to, kind of coordinate and take leadership from or take direction from forces on the continent that are, fighting imperialism in their daily struggles, that are, facing the brunt of, I guess, AFRICOM's or the US and the West, I guess, assault on their I guess, democratic rights, right? So we created a steering committee of the US Out of Africa network, and we kind of put out a call to, what we thought of as revolutionary forces on the continent that, are anti-imperialists that are addressing these types of issues. And so we have a number of formations that are part of that effort, part of that steering committee, and that are providing the leadership once again to our work. Forces like the Revolutionary Socialist League in Kenya, right, that is holding all sorts of educational events this week about AFRICOM, and have done that in the past, right, that have held rallies and actions around AFRICOM and Western military presence and bases that are really trying to confront these issues head on the ground. There are forces in Zimbabwe, like the Zimbabwe movement of Pan-African socialists, that are doing similar things, that have done similar things in over the years. There are forces in Nigeria, like the Moyo Pan-African Solidarity Center, that, we're doing this work long before BAP really, I guess, started its own campaign. But we see it as important to connect our efforts because, like I said earlier, we see our struggles as linked, like Mamta said, the war on, African people here in the US mirrors the war on African people on the African continent and around the world. And so we're trying to think about how can we coordinate sustained action and really, be internationalists in our focus and our work. But yeah, we're connected to, a number of formations on the continent, and we continue to try and seek out more that we can build with and strengthen our efforts against AFRICOM and to get the US out of Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Jill. We'd be happy to share these resources with you. I can send you, my email, and we can pass on some of the resources that Tunde mentioned. I'll post that in the chat. Hamid?
Yeah, I had a question. One of the things in it, but it also showed up in one of your slides as well, Mamta. Good presentation. That while we talk about the minerals and all of that, but it's really the arable land, and where they talked about almost 65% of the continent as arable land. So now what is also happening is that while the U.S. is there for for military domination, China has been going in for economic control and just getting these long leases of land. I myself was in South Africa about 3 or 4 years ago and talking to some folks over there, and particularly there were some folks from Botswana that I had a chance to talk to in Zimbabwe. And, one of the big concerns was about, just both, how it has always been that how Africa has become this competing ground for both military domination and bases and a launching pad, and then the economic control coming from the Chinese. So yeah, I just started off, Tunde or yourself or anybody else has any thoughts on that, or there's been enough research that has happened, because there's like 99 million acres here, million acres there. So there's a whole lot of land acquisition that is going on as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely pass this on to Tunde as well in a minute, but I think BAP's position is very much that these are, this idea of Chinese colonization and domination and fighting China in Africa is largely sort of, US war propaganda and part of the US, anti-Asian sentiment that it's spreading. And it's largely a myth that China is operating in the same sort of warmongering, exploitative ways in Africa, the way that the US empire is. And, this is certainly, we've seen a lot of this even on the left, that, this talk about, well, what about China? What about Russia? And I think, for one, the Chinese involvement in Africa, the Chinese trade in Africa looks quite materially different from US involvement, which is largely through these, like IMF loans and these sort of debt dependency, this forcing countries into these austerity measures, whereas Chinese investment, it's different, it's materially different. It's usually on better terms, especially as far as the Chinese government is concerned. Of course, there are private actors, private Chinese corporations that are acting in China in the way that private capital acts. But I think that in terms of sort of the government investment in Africa has been on much better terms, and it's looking into more long-term investment than the sort of resources extraction austerity measure, like, dynamic that the US imposes. I don't know. I mean, Tunde, do you want to address that?
I agree mostly, like largely with what you said. I think, we look at China's history of relations with the African continent, a similar history of colonization, right? A history of cooperation through much of the 20th century, and now in this present time, I think you spoke to the situation right now. I mean, obviously, like this question of China is, I think, on the minds of a lot of folks on the African continent, as I think you raised, Hamid, but I think there is a lot of, U.S. Posturing and a driving of the narrative that comes from, Western sources that colors a lot of that. But yeah, I wouldn't disagree with most of what you said, Mamta. I just, want to say, yeah, like land is key, right? Like it's, what did Malcolm X say? Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality, like basis of all independence and revolutions based on land. So I think, we even say, and I think, Mamta, you mentioned that, AFRICOM is about securing access to the land, labor, resources, and of the African continent for Western forces, for multinational corporations. So I think, you really covered it.
Jill, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. You all able to hear me? Okay, so I'm going to push back a little bit on that. All nation states have their self-interest. And for us to pretend, and particularly for those of us who are Pan-Africanists, to pretend that other countries don't have self-interest, right, and just may structure those deals differently, right, but still in their own self-interest, I think puts African people wherever we may be placed in the world, operating through rose-colored lenses. So I'm going to say that this last trip that I was on, where I was teaching in South Africa, I went to 5 former countries that I worked in over the past 30 years. South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Uganda, Ethiopia, and then Egypt. And all of them received some type of development, long-term development from China, which clearly transformed the infrastructure from over 30 years, at least when I was there 30 years ago. But at the same time, I also recognized and was listening to stories of Africans who talked about the Chinese and the structuring of their deals. They don't hire local hires. So the transfer of technology and the knowledge of how to build the roads, right, aren't transferred to the African people, right? Once China leaves, the workers leave, that they can do this themselves, as if Africans can't already build roads, right? So I would say that those of us who that we need not look through rose-colored lens about China. And then Russia is not Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as you already know, dissolved, right? Russia is the Federation of Russia is a different entity, political entity, and it does operate differently than, it has a different ideological position than the Soviet Union did in terms of supporting African liberation struggle. So once again, I would say that we do need to be concerned as Pan-Africanists about the role of Wagner, right? Just like we need to be concerned about the role of US security agencies, right, and militarization, we also need to be concerned about the use of Wagner, right, as Russia's arm of militarizing the African continent. So I would just say, at least for me, I don't look at any of these nations, any of these other countries, right, as supposedly just operating from their own altruistic behaviors, right, or beliefs towards African people, whether it be in the continent or wherever we may reside. And so I would want a little bit more conversation around that. Like, I want to know exactly how are these bills, the finance, direct finance of projects, how are they actually structured? And if they're structured with the elite Africans, right, what do the people say? Because at least some of my on the ground folks say that they're trying to hold the elites accountable to not give up their natural resources, right, to China. So I would like a little bit more, I guess, in-depth conversation around that, if you can provide that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that, we should be, examining these deals and, understanding that these states aren't necessarily acting out of altruism. I didn't mean to imply that. I just, want to take into account the state of the world that we live in today and, the balance of power. And so I put a comment in the chat about, these forces that kind of advance, kind of Western hegemony, right? And that, China and Russia don't necessarily have access to those. Sure, we can be skeptical of certain things that are happening on the continent, but I think we have to be cognizant of the real, the main forces on the continent that are driving a lot of, the economic situation right now, the lack of sovereignty and things like that. So I just wanted to, say that, I think you have a good point. But yeah, I do want to, especially since we are in the belly of the beast, I think it's important to be cognizant of that as well. That we are here in the United States, and what do we have the ability to I guess impact or push from where we stand. So that's kind of where our position, or my position, I guess, comes from. But yeah.
Thank you, Tunde. I see Akil has his hand up. Akil.
Hey, yeah, thank you all so much for all this really thorough and incredible information. About this question, I kind of have a related question, which is, how does Black Alliance for Peace navigate? It feels like there are two sort of things happening. One is an internal, like, Black debate around how to navigate, the role that, Africans are being put in between competing world powers. And, I won't say competing as in equivalent, because I don't believe that. I believe that the European Western NATO axis, as you called it, is the #1 threat to literally humanity's continued existence. But competing, they're competing with Russia and China. So that sort of like navigating that versus this position of being in the US and all of the information that we're receiving about the world is filtered through, corporate news, and, look how they lie about Black people here. Look at how they lie about Palestine. Look how they lie about, Ukraine. Look at every single issue. So how to navigate that, but then also not wanting, maybe there's really genuine skepticism of these deals, but then not wanting that to be weaponized in favor of a narrative that is part of an imperialist, like people kind of sharpening their knives looking at China too, but then also not wanting to ignore it because of how it might be taken. I mean, just kind of that distinction, and then also adding to that kind of complexity of how to have an internal debate when everything is being preyed upon by others, is also how to handle sort of the difference of talking about these issues from the position of being in the US, as opposed to, in African states where people are making these decisions about which deals to take. Like, do you feel like there's that there's a requirement to be sort of agnostic about their decisions because you're not there, and what your focus is on what the US does because simply of the position? Or do you believe that kind of as a internationalist Black organization that you would you don't see a distinction in terms of location? It's like you're from the same position as people in Africa itself. Does that make sense? In a kind of a confusing way of putting it.
Yeah, Tunde, do you want to?
That's a good question. A lot of interesting points there. And I'll say this. I mean, I think we try to recognize our positioning as Black internationalists operating in the United States, right? Like though we don't see or Pan-Africanists, we don't see the U.S. as our home or anything like that, but that's where we are operating from, and for that reason, we take particular positions. We also take leadership, or like we work with our partners on the continent to formulate a lot of our strategy and how we look at and think through how we look at certain issues. And a number of like the revolutionary organizations we work with have very similar perspectives on this issue of China and Russia and their impact on I guess the continent. So it's a very complicated question, but I think and there's a lot of debate, right? But I think it's best for us to I guess struggle around this with folks within I guess our ranks, within our alliances and coalitions, rather than to condemn like a China and Russia publicly when we are an organization that a lot of folks from around the world associate with the U.S., right? And so I think that's a big part of it. I don't know if I'm even really answering your question fully, but I think there are a number of folks that have spoken on this in much more eloquently than I just did. I like the video that Mamta put in the chat. I think there are a number of solid discussions on the role of China and Russia that a lot of the organizations I dropped into the chat earlier have given or done. But I would say that from our position, we are an organization that has most of its membership in the U.S. And so for that reason, we aren't condemning China or Russia. We're actually condemning the U.S. war on China, the U.S. war on Russia, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with that. I mean, I think BAP has some really clear positions, and they are grounded in an anti-imperialist sentiment, right? And they are in solidarity with global movements in the global South. And that's where they're coming from. And it is very hard, as you noted, Akhil, to actually wade through like the kind of crazy, overwhelming sort of regime change propaganda that comes out, that is pervasive in the US. And it's actually very, very difficult to find the voice, even with the, and I don't want to get into this, but even with the protests in Iran, right? Like, Western feminists or, people in the heart of empire taking up the cause of the Iranians. I mean, this is right, like not understanding that, like, there's a responsibility to understand, I think, that certain narratives are advanced in the US media by the US government that are basically fodder for their bloodthirst for regime change. And same with Libya, right? Like the narratives about who Gaddafi was and what he stood for and what he was doing was overwhelmingly negative. And it was, he was made out to be this like international villain. And we see this over and over again. And this is, this is part of the US propaganda for war and for and for really sort of dangerous purposes that I think that like BAP is very mindful of. And I would say, go on BAP's website and there are a number of, I think it's under resources, but a number of issues on which BAP has issued very principled statements, and including Ukraine and other sort of crazy sort of propagandized, US proxy war happening in Ukraine, right? That there's a lot of, even from the left, a lot of sort of confusion around in the US, mainly because we're only subjected to this sort of US media, which, you know, it represents, it looks like it's like the majority of humanity, but it's not. I mean, the US and its, like, you know, criminal partners in Europe don't represent our minority. They do not represent the majority of humanity, which actually opposes, whether, you know, you believe whatever position you take on Russia, opposes Russian sanctions on Russia. It is, and those are illegal, and those are hurting people in the global South. Anyway, I think Blair, you had your hand up.
Hi, yeah, Blair here, Blair Beekman. Thank you. This is one of the first meetings that I've attended live. I've been enjoying your Tuesday meetings for months now. Thank you. A person offered public comment a few items back, a few persons back, that, you know, I thought very nicely asked the question of what exactly people in Africa are feeling about this. And it was, you know, in my understanding that before COVID happened, there was a good democracy movement that was going on kind of throughout Africa. And there was just kind of an excitement about, you know, youth things, and it was a good energy that I think was different a bit than what like the Hong Kong democracy ideas were about. I'm guessing, I'm not fully sure, maybe that someone can clarify that here, but I thought the African democracy movement was really a good thing going on before COVID. Maybe that's something to consider as ideas of freedom and how to, I don't know, work towards, you know, self-determination. I don't know. If someone has any comment on it, that would be nice. I'm a bit, I guess, a Bostonian, I guess is the way to put it in my thinking. I'm sorry about that. But hopefully it can be addressed. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for those comments and for that question. I'm just trying to sort of thinking about, wanted to make sure I understand what you're referring to. I mean, I think that there are a lot of resistance. There's always resistance to U.S. imperialism on the ground, and I'm not aware of sort of a collective unified resistance on the African continent pre-COVID-19 you're mentioning. But I mean, I think the resistance is ongoing, and it takes different forms, right? Like, for example, the Mali government recently threw out the French from their country, right? And whether that government itself, you know, wouldn't be maybe what you would call quote unquote progressive, but there is resistance to US imperialism, to French imperialism on the continent, and it takes many different forms. So the French had created this formation called the G5 Sahel in the Sahel region that we were talking about, and imposing all these, you know, conditions like increased military spending by those 5 countries as a condition of being in this, you know, part of this initiative. And yeah, I think the governments in many African nations face a lot of local resistance to allowing US bases on their land, in their country. And those pressures, you know, there were a bunch of civilian deaths in Mali as a result of the French recent French occupation, and they ousted the French. Of course, the French moved next door to Niger after that. But yeah, I mean, I think these forms of resistance take different, there are different forms of resistance going on the continent.
Yeah, my thinking may have been a little, maybe a little shallow on the issue, but I felt it was a more, there was a democratic movement of ideas of democracy that was more home-based than what Hong Kong was doing. And I don't know, maybe I just casually read that somewhere in a you know, doctor's room magazine or something, you know, and but it's always stuck with me. And I work towards accountability with the future of technology practices. I hate to say it, but I'm a part of the ACLU movement of a better technology future that's possible with open public policy practices. And so I'm interested how, you know, what's going on in different places of the world. And I heard that it set up, you know, and the talk about, you know, what's going, the IPR stuff you were talking about, technology stuff, whatever its name was. In this country, we've got, you know, the geofencing ideas going on in every local neighborhood now, in business district, that, you know, really just collects a ton of data and surveillance from ourselves that really fits into that narrative of what they're doing in Africa at this time. And we're just being really monitored at each step of our lives, and how to address that with accountable technology practices and policies is an important concept for myself. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Is there any other questions or comments, or should I pass it back to you, Matheus, Nadia?
I just have a very simple one really quickly, which are, I mean, maybe we can also find this out online, but what are specific actions we can take during this month of action to support?
Sorry, I feel like Monty, you probably had this covered. But yeah, we were asking that folks, you know, watch the webinar that we put together on October 1st. Hold teach-ins kind of like this webinar that y'all are hosting right now. We also encouraged during the third week, or we're encouraging that folks take some sort of action. We suggested banner drops or rallies, or you know, some sort of I guess direct action. And we have like a banner drop guide on the website. I can post a link to it. And then, you know, we were just encouraging the folks share some of the materials, I guess some of the graphics or some of the PE political education materials that we've distributed or put out in general throughout the month. And then, you know, what Mamta put in the chat as far as joining the US out of Africa Network, or joining the Black Alliance for Peace, or the BAP Solidarity Network. I think those are, you know, great actions to take as well, as we, you know, work towards, you know, getting the US out of Africa and shutting down AFRICOM. But looks like Mamta, you put a lot of good links in the chat.
Yeah, and also how to endorse this action for individuals and organizations to endorse the International Month of Action. And if anyone's interested in hosting a teach-in, we can provide, you know, tools, toolkits, and assistance with that as well.
Cool. Well, I want to say thank you so much, Mamta, for all that information, for presenting it so you know, well thought out, laying it out so beautifully. And I also want to recognize that the brother Tunde is in Atlanta, and it's 10:30 over there. And so thank you so much for sticking through with us and providing that wealth of information. We appreciate having you all on. Hope to have you on in the future. Yeah, and so folks can hit up Mamta if y'all have any more questions, or hit up those resources. I think for the rest of the meeting, we're just gonna provide updates on the fight here at home, specifically around PATHE, and then Akil is gonna talk about a PRA lawsuit we have on Council Member Paul Koretz. And yeah, Monta and Tunde, y'all are welcome to stay for that. And so it's kind of hard not to talk about the recent recording of city council members, saying racist shit that's been floating around. Folks were at city council today. Take care, Lana. Yeah, mad love for. But the reason I bring it up is because the language they were using is, and we know that exists in all aspects of our local government. We focus heavily on police and what they do, but obviously it's in city council too. And Mary Martinez, the council president, who famously, now infamously, compared a little black boy to a monkey, was actually a board member for the Los Angeles Unified School District before she was a council member. And that's that's kind of where our focus is for this program PATHE, providing alternatives to hinder extremism. It is an LAPD program, but it's implemented in LAUSD schools. And for folks that don't know, PATHE is it's a surveillance program where teachers, counselors, different community leaders look for risk factors for extremism in our youth. They're typically looking at, of course, this disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, Muslim, immigrant youth. And so we've been fighting back against that. And recently we uncovered that, so the PATHE program is funded through this federal Department of Homeland Security grant called Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And this was passed by City Council, presided over by now infamously racist Mary Martinez. This grant was approved for the LAPD to fund the PATHE program. And with that funding, the LAPD has now begun to train different individuals to roll out this risk assessment tool. And so we did a little Twitter thread here. Maybe I'll show it and I'll share my screen. Kind of uncovering what that training has kind of looked like. And one of the things we found out is they're training LAPD officers, obviously, LAPD civilian employees, but also we learned that LAUSD was in attendance. And so we know that their goal is to take this to schools and to train educators. And we know that it's rooted in SARS, which is one of the coalition's first fights, the suspicious activity reporting and the iWatch program. And Akil was, actually pointed out that they actually have an iWatch poster in the background of this photo, which I have to find a full version of. But yeah, just showing that it still contains these same racist roots. So we're really feeling the urgency. We see the shit is rolling out. So we're kind of rolling out a call to action to folks who know anybody who's a social worker. If you work in education, if you work in schools, if you hear about the PATHE program, let us know. If you're interested in, letting your students know about what PATHE looks like, or letting your fellow educators know, hit us up, and we'd be happy to, come in and talk about that. And yeah, I think that's where we're at with PATHE. Nadia or Akil, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Oh, as a part of updating on the, oh, sorry, Nadia, go for it.
Oh, no, I was going to say, no, I think that was it. I was going to actually pass it to you. Okay, go for it.
I was just going to say, as a part of updating on the records requests, we did submit now 4 records requests on PATHE. The 4th one is about that training that Matios just showed you the video, the social media of. We demanded the full attendee list and the invite list, and the location, date, and time of all currently scheduled future trainings. So we'll see what we get. But we're trying to expose these people. So then there's 3 other requests that we already did submit. One of them basically is trying to uncover who has been targeted by PATHE. And and it also asks for the training documents and the curriculum, etc. LAPD is currently telling us no to the records about who has been targeted. They say that these are records of people who are under investigation, so therefore they're exempt. So we're discussing and talking with legal people within the coalition, lawyers, to figure out our plan of action. There's also a records request that is about emails with a variety of different people, academics, teachers, educators, etc. And they said they have 5,000 documents and that they're going to get it to us in due time. So anyway, the point is we have a lot of stuff coming. We have regular research meetings every first and third Thursday at 5 p.m. where we dig through these documents together and try to uncover stuff. So if you're interested, shoot an email to stoplapdspying@gmail.com and we can get you that Zoom link. It's again the first and third Thursday at 5 p.m. We also have that's the website. Thank you, Matthias. And then we also have a regular working meeting, which is the third Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. That's next week, Wednesday at 6. So that's where we kind of all come together. That's not in public and just kind of discuss this. So again, if you're interested in joining. And then really quickly, yeah, wow, I really messed it up. I might as well be on East Coast time. And then, but one last thing to share that's tangentially related. So remember back at the very beginning of the meeting, Nadia was giving the rundown on like the variety of different names that this framework has taken, this framework of targeting people under the idea of them being violent extremists, countering violent extremism, the overall sort of term for the framework. It's gotten rebranded as targeted violence and terrorism prevention. Also preventing violent extremism. Preventing violent extremism initially started off as an FBI set of guidelines, and then it was also the name used for money that the Department of Homeland Security gave California to distribute. And California chose as one of its grantees the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which operates the Museum of Tolerance here in LA. And they gave them $250,000 to do preventing violent extremism programming in LA schools. They got this grant exactly the same year that LAUSD joined, not LAUSD, the Teachers Union, United Teachers of Los Angeles, joined us in opposing and successfully blocking a grant to expand CVE here in LA. So while we were blocking one grant, they were going around the backs of the teachers and giving this other grant to this nonprofit to do stuff in LA schools. One of the people who signed off on and endorsed that grant was none other than current council member Paul Koretz, who is not one of the three that is under fire at this moment, although he should be. People are pointing out that he has targeted in attack ads with very anti-Black language, a 20-year-old Black youth. But we submitted a records request specifically about his relationship with and his communications with the Simon Wiesenthal Center Museum of Tolerance, which got that grant. They ignored that records request for more than a year. So we sued. They gave us a small batch of documents and then tried to get it, shoo us away. And we didn't go away. So they gave us almost 2 gigs of documents. And we're getting ready to publicize the fact that we won this lawsuit. And I'll just give you all a preview here on this call of some of the things we were able to uncover. One thing that's kind of funny is that in his letter endorsing the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Preventing Violent Extremism grant, our emails, the emails they gave us showed that the Simon Wiesenthal Center drafted their own letter and sent it to him, and then he just put his name on it. Literally, his staffers just put his name on it. He might not have even seen it. We don't even know. Here's another thing that we found. Is it okay if I share screen briefly to show some of these things? Yeah. This is about ethnic studies. There's an ethnic studies resolution at the LA School Board. And this is Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center emailing a senior staff member of the Paul Koretz office. Can Paul get this pulled? He's asking, can basically Paul get an ethnic studies resolution pulled? They actually respond to, I thought that this was funny. They respond to Simon Wiesenthal Center saying it's like not our jurisdiction or something like that. But the fact that that they were trying to deal behind the scenes to censor ethnic studies is something. There was emails that were corresponding between Simon Wiesenthal Center's office. Oh, whoops. Suddenly I lost my screen share again. Oh, well, I can just say it out loud. Oh, here we go. Here we go. There were emails that were between the Simon Wiesenthal Center office and the police, sorry, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Paul Koretz's office, and the LAPD, all coordinating to surveil a Palestinian Day of Rage action in LA. So they were exchanging emails about it. At one point, they say that the LAPD was already monitoring social media about it. There were emails that, there was showed an email where the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Abraham Cooper wrote a letter to Paul Koretz opposing the partial defunding of the police, including school police. There was a message where Greg Martayan, who is again the senior staff member for Paul Koretz's office, was drafting a speech for Paul Koretz. And one of the lines was, when SJP, that's Students for Justice in Palestine, came to UCLA and began to chant Intifada, we made sure we were there to protest the hate. So you see a lot of anti-Palestinian racism, a lot of coordination with LAPD, and also just this really funny thing that the organization wrote their own endorsement. So we're going to come out with some of this stuff soon, so stay tuned. But again, please join us if you're interested in doing research with us, first and third Thursday of the month at 5, and for our regular working meeting, the third Wednesday of the month at 6. So you can see us twice next week if you want to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Akil. And if we're at the announcements phase, like I said, we were at City Hall today, responding to that racist recording by those 3 city council members demanding their resignation. And we're going to be right back there tomorrow morning. So if you're in LA, meet us at City Hall at 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning to demand those city council members, Mary Martinez, Joseph Dio, and Kevin DeLeon, resign immediately. Yeah, that's all I've got. Thanks so much, everybody.
Can you make it? Is there room for another announcement? Just putting people just an advance notice. So a couple things happening. So next week and the following Saturday is 022, which is sort of remembered every year as a day of action against police violence, October 22nd. And then Stop LAPD Spine Coalition, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, and LA CAN, and some other groups are coming together to launch a week of action on that. Basically, that's going to start off with on this Friday, Matius, or Saturday, when these posters are going up across the city.
We're going to start promoting it on Monday, but they'll be going up this weekend.
Oh, okay, so they'll be going up this week. We're going to start promoting those on Monday, where these posters would be like at these bus stop size posters. They're not full billboards, but they're pretty big posters. They would say data-driven policing kills. It's also about facial recognition technology. So we wanted to have 6 posters, but the folks who are doing it, they could only do 2, which is great. You know, it was 2 more than we didn't have. So, and it's going to be over social media. So it'll be good for people who are walking down the street or taking buses and, you know, just in different neighborhoods, they'll be able to see that. And then next Tuesday is our general meeting, which will be in person at LA CAN. And where we're going to be doing art making and planning more of the 022 March and Rally, which is the following Saturday. So we'll come and join us for that. Then Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, we're having a press conference outside City Hall about the letter that we had sent to the city council back on September 9th, demanding that they repeal that Special Order 11 that was instituted as a for the transparency and reporting and auditing of information and surveillance technology. This is where the LAPD and the Police Commission had gone to Oakland to import a consultant who then acted as a community perspective, a complete conspiracy and a fraud on the people of Los Angeles. And then, so this is all going to be coming out as well very soon. And then that next Friday at 5 o'clock is a ROC meeting, the resident organizing committee meeting at LA Can. We're going to be talking about the march again. And then finally on October 22nd, we're going to be meeting at 1 o'clock outside LA Can in Skid Row. And then at 2 p.m., we're going to march and all of that. And then, so it's going to be great. It's going to be a great week of action. So it's just, I don't know, Meraki or Matios, if y'all want to add anything to that.
No, I think you got it, Hamid. Excited to see y'all.
Awesome. I was trying to get off the East Coast time myself, but at least I remembered a bunch of signals. So yeah, cool. All right, thank you, Matios. And hopefully we'll see people in City Hall tomorrow.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate y'all tuning in.
Good night, everyone.